Robyn Faith Walsh, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I think you wrote one of those books that all of us want to write when we are
Oh,
going through a PhD. And it's a book that is about the Gospels, but there's not that much about the okay, it's a lot about the Gospels, but a lot of the content of the book isn't strictly about the Gospels.
right.
But it's one of those books that is just, I think, completely paradigm shifting and wonderful, and I'm really glad I read it. Um, so I've been struggling to like figure out how to frame this conversation because there's so much here, and I don't want to lose people when we get into the depths of like German romanticism. But I thought maybe we could start, as you do in the book, with some of the myths that we tell about the field, because I think what you do is explore this really fascinating sort of intersection of where the myths about Christian origins came into contact with a school of people obsessed with looking for myths and obsessed with reading myths. So those two things are like the two things we need to cover in depth today. But could we maybe start with like some of the mythology around Christian origins and like what does it mean that
Yeah.
we as a discipline, biblical scholars have so often just believed the myths of Christian origins kind of uncritically?
Well, actually, it's interesting. I'm not sure it was uncritical. It was just the starting point from the questions were so embedded in the questions that people felt were necessary to ask at the time. So I know that sounds vague, but one thing that comes to mind for me is that every group wants to tell narratives and tell stories about where they came from and why they are significant and what makes them different. Give themselves kind of a storied history. I mean, it's kind of why I think people like what is it, like 23andMe or like
Yeah,
Ancestry,
yeah, yeah.
um, it literally doesn't matter like who my great 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 grandparents were, because, like, they would be strangers to me, right? But we still kind of look these things up, and I use it as a justification for being a Red Sox fan, because I have, like, this Boston family that's been going to Fenway since it was built. So we all do it, right? And so the thing that I started to look at with the Christian origins idea was the first of all is, like, Christian origins, even the idea of trying to find origins is in itself a really interesting, process and instinct and desire because that's a choice and it's a social choice. We don't have to know these things and it doesn't have to be our starting point, but it always seems that if we can identify an origin or trace something back, as far as we can go, it gives it a certain authority that then we're able to trade off of to make certain kinds of claims back to like who we are and justifying perspectives. And in the case of things like religion, it is a very us them or, moral claims and justifications. So I wanted to look at that and, it really struck me. I think one thing that's significant, I've actually been working on this for my next book, is I recognize that I was at a point in time in the field where I could see around me these things were naturalized. Of course, Christian origins. Of course, X, Y. We can untangle some of those things, which I try to like. Of course, there were Christian communities. Of course, Paul founded his churches, right? Like there are all these claims being made. Of course, you translate a certain word this way and not the other way in Greek. But I was coming from I was the first person in my family to go to a 4-year college. My parents eventually got advanced degrees, but they did it, the slow. My dad did it through the GI Bill. They did it the slow way. I was raised, Catholic, but I was a very, very bad Catholic like, I have my parents found my old workbooks in the basement, and I was drawing mustaches on Mary, and, like, I was clearly had no idea what was going on.
The worst Catholic.
I was the worst. I was quite bad, and not because I wasn't, like, a good kid or didn't mean well, but, like, I also was, like, a feminist without knowing I was a feminist at the time, being like, "Why can't I be Pope?" Like, I didn't get any of it. And, so when I went to college, I didn't go to study religion. I thought I was gonna be a physician, because that's the area my family is in. And, I started studying Greek. I think I told myself it would help with the MCATs, and then long story short, like, here I am. I started studying this stuff, and I couldn't let it go. It was just so interesting. But I do like the ancient world as a whole, as you point out. I don't just look at the Bible. I really look at it in context of the ancient Mediterranean. But I couldn't figure out, like, I would take classes, and I could tell that the professors, especially, when I was at Harvard Divinity School, they were starting from a starting point that had all kinds of presumption that I did not hold any of those presumptions. I did not understand why it was faith versus works when I looked at the Greek, for example. I didn't understand why certain passages had to be interpolated out of Paul, because clearly Paul would never say this, until I started to realize, "Oh, you're making Paul look like Martin Luther." Right? Like, I had to figure these things out along the way, and that's what drew me to trying to trace the field back. We all have to do it in the field. You have to read previous scholarship, and you're supposed to understand different trajectories for how different methodologies develop in the field and where they come from. But I don't know that we always go all the way back. And I could tell that part of that was also an acclamation or expectation within the field itself. Like, you want an A in class. So if your teacher tells you this is interpolated, you repeat that it's interpolated. And I had, I guess, back to drawing mustaches on Mary, I had a resistance to that. It didn't seem um, self-evident to me to do any of the things. And so that's when I really started trying to look at where do these ideas come from. And so we could talk more about German Romanticism, but I started to realize how much perspectives on Christian origins and making certain claims about the antiquity of not just Christianity itself, obviously, it's an ancient thing, but certain perspectives or interpretations or passages or ideas could be traced back and therefore be authorized in a certain way, understanding how that was all wrapped up with conservatism in Germany, and then, what happens in the 20th century, like, all of that was
Yeah.
very interesting to me.
Yeah. So, okay, here's a really good I think you use a really good example in the book. You talk about Hero Paul, which I think is, like, one of our most important kind of founding myths that often we carry forward. Could you talk a little bit about who Hero All is, how we see
Yeah.
him, and, like, even what, like, in Paul's letters, if you actually read them closely, what you actually see?
You see a guy who's not doing very well.
Yeah.
I went to grad school to study Paul. The reason I did the Gospels actually was because everybody around me, like, there you've probably noticed, like, in the field, there'll be, like, waves of, like, everybody does one thing. Like, right now, it's book culture. Everybody's doing book culture.
Yeah, that's true.
And, like, but when I was coming up, it was like everybody was doing Paul, and I was like, "Brats," like, that's what I came here to do. But then I had been doing some work on Mark, and so I shift tracks. But so with Paul, when you read his letters, he's trying to be really strategic. He's trying to insert himself in a particular way with authority, because he's obviously trying to claim a certain authority through let's just call them what they were, like divination practices. He's seeing the risen Christ. But he didn't know him. He didn't know Jesus. So he's trying to feel out a way to give himself that authority. But, like, at heart, this guy is a Pharisee, which means he interprets scripture for a living, and he's brilliant at it. He's really, really good, but he's also clearly been educated at what we would call Middle Platonist. He knows his philosophy. And so I think it's natural to him. Like, I don't think he's trying to, like, appeal to Gentiles. I think he's just educated in the diaspora, and he can read through the Septuagint a way to reimagine the significance of Christ relative to all these Stoic ideas and other things that he has in mind. Now, this is at a period of time in the first century, during the empire, second century, when people are really interested in these kinds of interpretations. They're interested in Judean stuff. Even the Jewish holy books are considered very, very ancient and important to non-Jews, to the Romans. And then I think Paul is able to, use this kind of skill of interpretation to bring these things together. But these groups he's talking to, we have this idea, I call it the early Christian Big Bang at various points. Like, we have this idea that Paul, like, says, "You're the Corinthians," and boom, they're the Corinthians, and it's his Corinthian church. And but when you read it, they're like, there's a guy who's, like, shacking up with his mother-in-law, And they clearly think because Paul said that they're going to have pneumatic bodies and they're already spiritual bodies and they're already sharing in it, that means they could do whatever they want because they got a free pass. They already have the free pass, so they're good. So they're going to the brothel. And he's like, no, 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 no. You
It's
know,
like the Maury Povich of the ancient world.
it's really kind of cool. I love Corinthians for that, or First and Second Corinthians for that reason.
Yeah.
But then even like a group where he's like kind of cool, like Galatians, um, like he also was like, I hear you're circumcising. I hope the knife slips. Like they're not getting along. He keeps talking about super apostles and opponents. Like there are other people doing the same thing he's doing, maybe with not the bona fides of like, I'm a Pharisee and, super educated and you can hobnob with me and feel like you're in a college seminar. Maybe not on the same level, but other people are all like, I sometimes use influencer culture as a analogy because it works these days with my students. But he's an influencer. Like there's a lot of people doing the same thing, but it doesn't always work, And so the idea that he founded these cohesive communities that then spread out throughout the ancient Mediterranean and, eventually result in the triumph of Christianity, it doesn't work when you actually read the letters. But what something like Acts of the Apostles does, or the way that he's canonized later on, it creates this hero figure where he is that founding father, of the religion. You even get ideas of like, he was a Christian, anachronistically. He was never a Christian. That word didn't exist. He thought the world was ending. He was not worried about, group dynamics in the sense of like institutionalization. He thought there was going to be a great conflagration. And like Christ was going to come down with a heavenly army, and like he thought the world was ending. So, you get later with the pastorals and everything, like, you get an idea of institutionalization, you get that with Acts of the Apostles because you had to go back and create a world in which he was that founding figure, and so that's why I call him Hero Paul, and,
Hero Paul. I like
yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah, because he
Well,
had
and then
stature.
yes. And then, yeah, you're already kind of referring to like that veneer, the Big Bang, that later veneer of the pastorals and of Acts of the Apostles. And we get this nice little tidying up of the tradition to turn it into sort of a coherent, like mythology, I guess you would say. But one of the other things that it does is it helps us see Christianity as something totally unique. It helps us
Yeah.
see this as like unprecedented. There was nothing else like it. There are no comparables because it came from God. Could you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Sure. I meditate on this a lot because we do have this idea that it is, like you say, unique, that these narratives were unique. And it was something about that specialness and that uniqueness that struck people and grabbed people. And then very quickly you move to language like conversion, right? And it feels like a wholesale turning where people just like heard this narrative and it was inspirational or grabbed them. And so therefore they changed their whole lives and understood it as like capital T truth. And that's kind of a broad stroke, but that's essentially the idea. But what starts to undermine that is when you look at other narratives from the same time period, or you start to sort of atomize something like the Gospels into, we spend a lot of time, us today, we have a different idea of what fact is, or what truth, again, capital T truth is. We can't, in theory, publish something without fact checking and footnotes, and you're not allowed to plagiarize. And like we have all these standards today, a framework for reporting something or for telling a story. Those were not the same operative fundamentals in antiquity for any kind of literature, right? Or storytelling necessarily. And there were a lot of reasons for this. People weren't as connected as they are today. It wasn't as easy to fact check things. People weren't as worried about specific details, right? And we also tend to treat the Gospels as reporting instead
Yeah.
of literature. And so, one thing I talk about often because it's pretty vivid and I think helps illustrate it is the empty tomb. Like Paul tells us that he tells us so little about the historical Jesus that when he actually does say something, you're sort of like, you know, you assume he heard it from like Peter, right? Like we could talk more about why that is. But he says Jesus was buried, which is exactly what you would expect from someone who's crucified. But we get the empty tomb story in the Gospels, but, like, the idea of the body disappearing, the physical body disappearing into some kind of apotheosis, that was so common in antiquity. It was so common, and, like, even empty tomb stories are so common. I don't think anybody in antiquity would run into that part of the Gospels and be like, "I don't know," like, it would've been like, "Oh, I know what the symbolism means." You're kind of riding a wave of these signposts in literature and antiquity. And these writers are also trying to make their story understandable and palatable and comparative. So just little things like that, when you start to look at the broader ancient Mediterranean, especially during the empire, you start to realize the Gospels fit, well, not just the Gospels, but Paul, the Gospels, what we call the New Testament and early Christianity, it fits very coherently within a set of practices. We use the term religion, but eventually, but into a set of associations. I know you worked with John Kloppenborg, so that word is, very, uh, has a lot of meaning behind it. But it's sensible. It's very sensible. It's a narrative that would have appealed for a lot of different reasons to a lot of different people, and the practices themselves fit again very coherently within the ancient world. What people make of it later on, now that's a different story because once we get into 2nd to 4th century, things kind of change, but that's the case with everything, right? Like, but for Christian origins, yeah, Christianity was like what we call Christianity was like new on the scene, but it
Yeah.
wasn't exactly different.
It's funny, like, I was definitely raised with this sort of story that one of the reasons we know this is true is because there's nothing else like it, and I think when I was so surprised to read the church fathers and realize, like, they knew there was other stuff like it out there. So much time like, they spent a lot of time trying to say why Christianity was unique. And is it I think it's Justin Martyr who starts talking about, like, how it's demons that came in and, like, put these stories into Greco-Roman culture. I interviewed Richard C. Miller as well, and I can link to that
Okay.
below for people watching. So
Yeah.
he showed me a ton, and I read his book about all of the many, many comparable features. So yeah, so we have these myths, we have this kind of story that, is becoming a unified whole in the 2nd to 4th centuries. Let's jump to the relatively modern world, to the German Romantic period, because on my bingo card for this year, I did not have the fact that the Brothers Grimm fairy tales would give me a new insight into the reading of the New Testament.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, it was like those, you get the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. I hope people, like, watching and listening know exactly what we're talking about. But, the famous ones like Cinderella, like, stories like that, Robin Hood or sorry, not Robin, Little Red Riding Hood. Um, and, like, you'd read these as a kid, and you might either get, like, the kind of condensed, sanitized versions, but every now and then you'd come across a really
Like the
old
real
version.
psycho versions.
Yeah, like, my
Yeah.
grandma had one, from when she was a girl, and it was, like, really, like, disturbing. But, the Brothers Grimm in Germany, part of the German Romantic period, start to study fairy tales, and this is where your work goes and kinda gives us some really interesting insights into how biblical studies evolved. It's the way that we read these stories of early Christianity. Could you talk about that a
Yeah,
little bit?
sure. So it goes back to this origins idea again, where especially, it was an education for me too, working a little bit on this portion. I can tell you why I went with the Brothers Grimm too. There's another story there. But figuring out how like Germany becomes unified around this period. It was kind of like a bunch of little, I think I used the term statelets in the book, but it was like little kingdoms that like kind of come together and sort of like talking about when the New Testament starts to come together as a canon, like once you start to compile sort of disparate texts and figures and peoples together, there is this search for a unified narrative, right? But the problem was when the Germans, who are now like the newly found Germans, look back into like antiquity, into history, there are two cultures that dominate: the Greeks and the Romans, right? Like and the Egyptians, but the Greeks and the Romans for like continental Europe, and nobody else is like is writing anything apparently. Like nothing is really preserved. You might find out about like some wars Rome had with Germania and like some like there are some warriors with like there's like something Vernictrix or something. I can't remember his name. You might remember, but like,
No, I don't remember.
long names
Mhm.
I can't, remember. So they would have like little touchstones maybe with like a figure or two, but of course, like it's a Roman story that they're getting handed down. So what happens to the German people in that Roman story?
Yeah,
So
of course, yeah.
right. So what you start to see around the same time in the field, people are looking at Christian origins. Now, back then, you didn't really have disciplines in the academy the same way we do now. So you could be somebody who like studies Christian origins and reads the New Testament, but you also sort of dabble in like fairy tales, right? Or you're also sort of working on, like Aramaic too. Like you could just kind of do whatever you wanted. There wasn't like a set kind of like, this is your discipline and here are the parameters of it. And so you see kind of two things start outside the academy, but also kind of adjacent. You had people start to like make up text like, oh, look what I found, a long lost German author from the first century. Like, here's this beautiful epic poem, just like Homer. Like people would magically find texts that would eventually like people would figure out, you know were forged. But the other thing you start to see is kind of like this search for a national identity through these texts. And so, one thing that starts to happen within the academy, broadly speaking, is this search for the oral stories of the people that didn't write the things down. So, for the Germans, the oral stories, and that should sound familiar. We can talk about oral tradition theory for the Bible too, if we want to. But there starts to become this methodology or this approach of looking for oral stories. Because if we don't have the written stories, if we don't have our version of Homer and we've proven that this one that was found is fake, maybe we have oral stories. So, what the Brothers Grimm, as an example, start to do is they claim they're just collating, collecting the oral stories of the German people. And there's a different kind of point of emphasis. It's not about like the built environment the way that Greece and Rome tend to emphasize, like turning stone into marble and like the grandeur of like technology and building structures and everything for those cultures and philosophy and so forth. It's natural springs and the forest and nature and witches and wolves and, rando princesses and like those kinds of stories. So like more people of the land and like folk tales, like literally folk, meaning the people, folk tales. The reason I went with the Brothers Grimm is pretty much everybody's heard of them.
Yeah.
My editor at Cambridge, who published the book, told me that they were her great uncles. So they actually weren't originally in the first draft of the book. And I was like, oh, really? Like, let me put in a little section. So I put that in for her.
Wait, the Brothers Grimm were her great uncles? Is
Yeah,
that
or they were
okay?
related to her somehow. And so
Wow.
that's why I was like, this is fantastic,
Yeah,
like,
that's cool.
so as
Yeah.
a nod to her. But then when I started to research it, I realized that like their methods were, I mean, like I should be careful because it's gonna make them sound bad, but they weren't doing anything that like an academic wasn't like this was normal for
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
time period, but like they weren't going out in the field and like formally taking statements from like, the little old woman in the shoe. They were like talking to their girlfriends. Like, have you ever heard a story? Like the cleaning woman would show up and they'd be like, hey. Um,
You weren't interviewing Little Red Riding Hood?
They weren't, and, like, if they wrote a story and someone, like, an academic, like, said, "Hey, this is BS," they were really good at writing nasty letters, and they would, like, write really mean letters to people and, like, shame them to, like, stop bad mouthing, like, it's really interesting. They
That's
are very
hilarious.
story.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, so, like, just looking at the messiness, again, it's not just about them. I'm actually like, they should be studied on their own just for, like, how interesting their methodologies were, and I'm not saying that the stories they collected were not, like, well done, you know what I'm saying? But,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
this
Yeah.
idea that, like, these are the fairy tales of the German people,
Yeah.
there was a
Yeah.
moment when that was super important
Yeah.
politically, nationally, and again, at the same time that people are like, we're gonna find the oral traditions of the Christians. For me, there was a lot there, like, oh, it treats Christianity like a nation.
Yeah.
to use the same methods, and, like, that seems to be what everybody in Europe was doing at the time, like, Shakespeare's the spokesperson for England, like, the fairy tales become, like, the thing for the Germans, like, everybody kinda develops their own national identity that goes back to an idea of origin.
And with that, you talk about the way that authors are viewed not as kind of creative agents in their own right or but much more as like people who compile these kind of stories and bring them together and like almost representative of a community, just like formalizing things that everybody knows and that does that make sense?
Yeah, they're like spokespersons or like a
Yeah.
filter, it's almost like they don't matter. Like, they just happen to be the person recording the community's perspective or the shared stories, the oral storytelling, but that's not what you have when you look at the Gospels, it's just not. I mean, I don't deny that there could be some elements of, like, oral storytelling present in the Gospels, it's not that, I'm not trying to do an either or, but, we talked about the empty tomb as one example, that is a literary feature
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
ancient writing.
Yeah.
There are other elements of the Gospels. I mean, like, they follow more or less, the structure of an ancient biography at a time when these were being produced. They're very concerned with hitting certain notes of using, for example, Greek and Roman philosophy in a very certain way. So they are very much of their time period. And then I happen to notice over time that scholarship on like the Markan community, Matthean community, and so forth, every single one was different because they were trying to mirror read different choices that the gospel writers were making as like, oh, well, Matthew has harsh words against the synagogue. Therefore, the Christian community is excommunicated from the synagogue. And that's why they wrote this story and included. But it was never the same. It was never consistent. There was kind of a sloppy methodology there in my mind of like, it's like how I would read at that time in my 20s, like, emails from an ex, right? Like you would try to figure out, like, this is what they really mean.
What are they
And
not saying here? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And like, he's really thinking that, like, so it was just it kind of had that vibe to me. And it didn't make sense when you looked at like Greek and Roman literature. And the fact that what I find so interesting is that you have with the synoptic gospels, like three authors writing the same story in three different ways, like authors do. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like
Yeah.
that. But we were spending so much time on like the community and the oral
Yeah.
tradition and all these things that were so like characteristic of this 19th century model
Yeah.
that was there mostly because, again, those were the questions people thought they needed to ask at that time because those were the questions everybody was asking. And it just didn't seem logical to me that that was the starting point.
So you mentioned this author called it's Schlegel, right? Who so he comes up with the idea kind of building on this stuff that I guess was in the air in German Romanticism to say that really what we need to do is study language and literature in order to see the community behind it. And what we get, I'm repeating a little bit, but I just want to make sure me and the audience gets this too. So essentially, like what
You can remind me too. I wrote this book a few years ago.
there you go. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe I read it more recently. But yeah, essentially what you get then is when you're studying, let's say the synoptics, you're studying three different gospel authors with slight discrepancies in how they tell their stories. Therefore, using this kind of methodology, you're actually studying three different communities. And one, maybe Matthew's community is a little more Jewish and Luke's community might be
Oh,
more
yeah.
Gentile. And this kind of model not only was like a way to read the gospels, it just became kind of a given in Christian origins, I think. Is that right? Like the
100%.
communities model is very common. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, as it relates to the romanticism piece, just to kind of make that connection, like, this was a time too, like, the word community itself was a word that was being used for, and again, folk, like, for the people, right? Folk tales. So it was very much by treating each one of these texts as a community, it was doing a couple of things. One is justifying the methodology we just talked about. And so you could have a discrete community of folk, Christian folk that you could then talk about. Back to Christian origins, if you just have these texts, you have Paul who's not doing very well, right? We don't even know what happens to him. and he has sort of like amorphously formed communities. And he's even writing to communities like the Romans that he's never even met, right? So that's like not even his. And so like this idea of his community is already sort of fraught. It's problematic. Then you have these gospels that pop up. And if they're just written by authors who are sort of experimenting with the subject matter, and we can talk about why that might have been, that's not helpful for Christian origins because, like, where are the people? Because so far in the first century, you just have kind of like poorly formed, like, but by the way, like social development, like that's social formations, that's normal. It takes some time, but you want it to be more like,
Big Bang.
oh, bing
The
bang,
Big Bang.
you know,
Yeah.
like, and you
Like
want it to
Acts. It just
course
happens and then like half of
melt.
Jerusalem's converted by the end of chapter 6 or whatever
Right,
it
and,
is. Yeah.
the other thing I started to see happening too was, like, it always was so strange to me, like, sorry, this is a side note, but,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
a New Testament textbook, right? Where does it start? The Gospels.
Yeah.
But the Gospels are that's not how this started. It started with Paul. So we already create that mythology of formation and origins by starting with Gospels that are dated like late first century if you're lucky. Some people date them to the second now.
Yeah.
And we treat that like a history to then as our starting point when the
Yeah.
starting point is Paul,
Yeah.
for all intents and purposes, for like our extant evidence. And so then if you start with the Gospels, who were the first converts to the Jewish movement? The poor around Galilee, like the downtrodden in Judea. And so I think there was an idea too, well, the gospel writers had to be part of a community and recording the oral tradition because the earliest followers of Jesus are not elite Romans, according to Paul's letters, though they kind of are. That's a lousy story. Like, we don't want this to be like some kind of bougie influencer religion. It's gotta be like, it's gotta, because he's not writing to poor people, to like sponsor his trip to Rome and Spain. Like he's writing to people of means. Um, anyway, like it has to be the starting point has to be what that story told us, right? And so, of course, the Gospels can't be just from like a literate Koine writer of the late first century. It has to be the Christian communities that were the illiterate, downtrodden masses. So the whole method reified a story we were telling ourselves about canonization and
Yeah.
structure.
And
Um,
in that, the miracle is also kind of it also reifies the miracle by, like, these illiterate people produce this mass movement, like, what else could this be other than God, right? Like,
Yeah, and they preserved all these oral stories and, we even had, like, something like the Jesus Seminar in the 20th century where it was like, "We're gonna vote on which are the literal words of Jesus. Never mind he spoke Aramaic and these are in Greek," whatever. Like, whatever. But, like, there's a certain theater to all of that that's really
yeah,
interesting to me too, and so again, it wasn't like a I actually now forgot your original question, but it wasn't like a pessimism on my part as much as a, "Wait a minute." Like, I don't get it. I don't get how we're, reifying this particular methodology. What was the original question, though? Sorry.
no, I forget too, but I think it
Okay.
was I forget. I think it was about communities, but that's
Oh,
kind of
yeah,
the point.
community.
Yeah,
That's why.
yeah,
There you go. Yeah,
yeah,
so I and the other thing it does too, by the way, is make Christianity bigger, right?
yeah,
So, it makes like if every text is a community. And this includes not just the canonical texts, but non-canonical texts as well. If every text can be a community, that's a lot of
yeah,
early Christian diversity
yeah,
at a time when what's going on I in Europe? Protestantism, right?
yeah, right.
So like they look just like us.
Yeah,
And so it really mapped on to again, something that seemed very sensible, very
yeah.
naturalized at its moment, but I don't think works for the ancient Mediterranean world so well.
This is a sidebar that was a little painful for me as I was reading it because, like, I am definitely like, I do talk about early Christian diversity or I talk about early Christianities sometimes, and it's like I think what you would say, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we're actually getting is diversity of literature, not so much diversity of social groups, right? Like
Correct.
maybe those
Yeah.
literature do come from diverse social groups, but we don't really know
Yeah, the
what.
book I'm
Yeah.
working on right now has a whole chapter on that, and it's been really interesting because it'll be fun because I'm getting a little bit of pushback on this because
Hmm.
I think the language of early Christian diversity is very well-meaning and can be very helpful, and especially, at a time when I think it's important and has been the case for a couple of generations of scholarship now, to not talk in terms of orthodoxy and heresy, right? There
Yes.
was
Yeah.
always kind of the idea, like, there's the Gnostic stuff, and that's heretical, and then there's the canon, and I think that started to break down in the late 20th century, especially as a result, in part, of finding Nag Hammadi and other things. Um and so it's well-meaning, because it's, like, inclusive and diversity is a good word and, like, all but I again, historically, yeah, I have some
Well, it's
doubt.
just the same methodology, right? It relies on the same methodology. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're making a mistake there, and so I'm working on that right now.
That's interesting. Well, I'm excited to see where this goes because there's a lot there. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, we should talk about what we actually do have, which is not diverse Christian communities, but diverse authors, or should I just say an authors network is the one thing. As you
Yeah.
say, that's the one thing we actually do have behind the Gospels are networks of authors. We can see similar networks of authors in antiquity, but nobody really ever talks about that. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about the author networks that may have created the Gospels?
Well, one thing I tried to look at was basically, what do I know about, how people wrote in antiquity? Because I would see a lot of this discussion about, like, well, the community that's obviously there and so forth, like everything that we've been talking about. But I wouldn't see a lot of conversation, that was happening in classics about, like, what did it take to publish something? Maybe this is actually, thinking about this for the first time, but maybe this is coming from Pauline studies, as I did. Like, there's a lot of scholarship and discourse in Pauline studies about, like, how can you tell he's gone through the progymnasiumata? Like, how can you tell his education level? Um, his rhetoric. Like, there's a lot of studies on his rhetorical strategies and his letter writing structure. And so then this shows that he had this kind of particular education, or I studied Philo a lot too, because he's one of our only other Middle Platonists, and obviously he's interpreting the Septuagint similarly. He's a better writer. He's far more educated, far more deep than Paul would have been. But those kind of comparisons, right? To look at how can we situate socially, economically, but also culturally, these figures. So it's work that had been done for Paul and his letter writing, but not really work that had been, I thought, sufficiently done for the gospel writers. So, like, what does it actually take to produce a book? And how did people do this? And so I said in the book that I wanted to move away from the idea of the community, of oral tradition, of the assumed religious context being the most formative. Again, not saying there weren't these things. I don't
Yeah.
know why you would
Yeah.
write a gospel if you weren't part
Yeah,
of an
right, yeah,
ecclesia, right? Like,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not saying these are randos. In theory, they could be, but I don't think that that makes a lot of sense. So I'm not saying that there's not an ecclesia, a church that they're a part of. I'm not saying that there isn't an oral tradition that they're recording. There very well could be. I don't know how to find it, but
Um,
someone else can do that. I don't have to do everything. So I assume that there's like an oral tradition there too. Fine, fine. Like that's all fine. But I wanted to really look at, like, concretely, what did it take to commit this thing to paper, or commit this thing to writing, and how would people have done this? And so I just say that the most formative network, social network for these writers were other writers, and some of them were not Christian because these guys had gone to school. They may not be the greatest writers in the world when you compare them to, like, someone writing in Attic Greek. They're writing in Koine, a common Greek. When you spend time, if you study Greek, like, reading other writers and you come back to the Gospels, you're like, "Ugh." Like, I can see why classicists don't love it.
kinda snotty about it.
Yeah, but I get it. Like, sometimes I get it, and I have to, like,
Yeah.
phone a friend and be like, "Remind me, like, why these are good." I'm sorry, it is a snobby thing, but when you read other Greek writers, these
Yeah, of
guys
course, yeah.
they're not the
Yeah,
best, you know?
yeah.
but they're
Even
not
Philo
all.
and Josephus, like, we have much better Jewish writers even.
Oh
Yeah,
god. I mean,
yeah,
like, Paul's not too bad. Like, Paul's
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Luke's, they lack a little they lack flair, you know? But I've been working on this too because I think it also is an interesting moment in Greek writing, by the way, like, in the 1st century, 2nd century, where we do get snooty about it, but it was just kind of a more accessible, like, workaday, the analogy I've been making with some people lately is like Hemingway.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
nobody says Hemingway's an idiot, he's hanging out with James Joyce, you know, like, he was doing something different, it was a different kind of
yeah,
writing, so it's an
yeah,
interesting moment, right?
yeah,
So they're still good writers, they've still been educated, they have still gone to school, I can tell they read Homer, right? Because that's what you do when you go to school, like, we all have to read Shakespeare at some point in high school. Like, everybody has to read this stuff, like, that's how their work exercises would have been, and they would have studied new comedy, they would have understood character structure, they would have understood, like, character types and stock characters and, like, how to write dialogue, and they've probably read some philosophy, so they've been reading the Pythagoreans and Platonist texts, and they know the words, they're using technical terminology, they know how to pass on lists of teachings from, philosophy philosophical leaders. They've been reading the Septuagint for sure. Like, I can tell everything that they've been looking at, not everything, but I can tell, like, a basic idea of how they've been educated and what they've been looking at, and how they've metabolized that into this writing, and the way that people wrote in these social networks was to read all these kinds of writings in their schooling or on the side, however they'd wanna do it. And then you would exchange I mean, there are no copy machines, there's no printing press, like, if you wanna share this, you copy out portions or the whole of your writing at great expense, by the way, to share with people, to publish, to circulate within a certain network or you read it out loud, to get feedback, and then you make some edits, and then maybe your buddy reads your version and says it stinks, and then he writes his version. And like you just kind of have these networks of literate people sending these things around and sharing them. And so that was a very different model than our Christian Big Bang, so forth model of like more elite educated writers, in the aftermath of the Jewish war at a time when the Jesus movement has been around for a few generations, at a time when it becomes clear that Jesus isn't coming back anytime soon, starting to write a biography of Jesus when previous to this, at least according to Paul, nobody really cared about the historical Jesus. I hate to say it that way, but like
yeah, it's true,
that
yeah,
wasn't the
yeah,
discourse. The discourse was about Christ and the significance of
yeah,
Christ, and this was predicted, and etc. But
yeah,
the fall of the temple then precipitates like a whole different uh,
yeah.
approach.
Yeah, I was reading, I forget who it was. It was like an older book on the Gospels, but it was an explanation of like why we get things like the infancy Gospels, and it was basically the explanation was like people had heard about Jesus and they had some questions like what
Yeah,
was he like when he was young, but like this author didn't make the next step to be like, wouldn't the Gospels be in response to the same thing? To somebody being like, "What was Jesus like? We don't really know. Well, let me write a story about it." Like, it
yeah,
almost sounds it almost sounds like from what you're saying, tell me if this is totally out to lunch, but like the gospel writers could have sat in an upper room in Rome over the course of a week together and written the Gospels,
totally.
and we wouldn't actually be any wiser. Is that a fair
Yeah,
assessment?
totally. I mean, like, that's the funny thing about it, right? Like, we always give, like, a decade in between, like, Marcus first and 70, which right, right.
Yeah. It turned 70, the temple fell, and he was like, "Let's get this thing on paper." Yeah.
Yeah, like Mark 13.
Yeah.
Um, and then, like, 10 years later, Matthew, 10 years later, Luke, like, we create a
Yeah.
ladder
Yeah.
so that and then you can be like, "Oh, but then oral tradition before that," and, like, we create that scaffolding.
Yeah.
Um Yeah, it gets harder and harder to teach that every year because I start to teach it and they just look at me like, I don't get it."
Well, and
Uh,
the dating is based, like largely, other than the temple stuff, but the dating is based on like the assumptions that if you have a community and they develop these new theologies, then we need like 20 years for, then another 10 for John to
Yeah, where
develop
did that
his
come
stuff
from?
about the
Like,
Logos.
this is
Like,
exactly what we're
takes
talking about.
time for people to come up with this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like in theory, yeah, these guys could have been like, this could have been a homework assignment and they cheated, for all we know now. But
Mark was in the middle and they were just both like,
yeah. Yeah, it's like
yeah.
that Mr. Bean meme.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, but we just don't know. It's sort of futile to guess.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but like you point out something really, I think, valuable, which is like the fact that we so easily replicate
Yes.
70
Yeah.
and then 80 and that because it takes 10. What? This is our own mythologizing within the field of these. I mean, it's not a completely unfounded crazy thing to say. I'm not saying that, but it's that kind of thing again coming from like as an outsider to the field, looking at it and just being like, why? Like you don't want to be a jerk, but what? We need to come up, I think, with alternative models. I'll say that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it would be helpful.
I feel something similar with reading Brent Nongbri's stuff about dating papyri, and it's a lot of the same kind of stuff. Is like we just make these assumptions, and then the field gets built on assumptions, built on assumptions, built on assumptions,
Yeah.
and you start to pull those apart, and it's like, holy crap, we could be wrong about all this stuff.
Here's
Yes, it's great. Yeah, it's
that's a great book.
fantastic.
And he has a
Yeah.
great blog too.
I wanted to ask about the Satiricon. Let's take a detour here because you give several examples. I also like the last, if people are listening to this podcast like in order, the last one will be Helen Bond, and I talked quite a bit with Helen about ancient biography and some of the examples. But I don't think she talked about the Satiricon, and it's fascinating. I
I
found the
think I'm the
connections.
first one to have done it. Because I remember reading it. I was at a classics library researching and for a variety of different things, and I came upon it, the widow of Ephesus with three crucified men. And I continued to read and I was like, has nobody like
That's no,
somebody
yeah,
somebody somebody noticed this? And I spent like an entire week like somebody saw like I
yeah.
gotta find somebody who
You assume it's going to
noticed.
be a German from the
Yeah,
1870s or something.
100%.
Yeah,
I assumed
yeah.
it was the German or, like, I was looking for there's a scholar named P.G. Walsh, no relation, but he tends to, like, he speculated that Apuleius may have known, like, Christianity may be present in the golden ass, some references to Christianity. So I was, like, searching for somebody, and so I think I'm the first one.
It's tropes. I don't know what, but the resemblance to the Gospels are a little uncanny for somebody
It
reading.
is. So it's a really interesting text. It gets, I think, attributed to a writer named Petronius, who was supposed to be in sort of the spot under the sponsorship or in the network of Nero. But that's one of these kind of like the gospel writer names being it's a later attribution. And there are a couple of articles in the Classical Quarterly from a great scholar I don't know personally, but named Ulrich Roth, who was pointing out that the dating makes no sense and that actually the Satyricon seems to be a collection of sort of almost like vignettes of stories, hence like, satire, so different, jokey stories. Some of them go back to what they call Ephesian tales. Like some of them are quite old, kind of replicating thematic things that people found entertaining, but that it's probably second century in part because there are some references within it, whoever wrote it, that make it pretty clear that they were aware of the letters of Pliny. So whoever wrote this was probably actually more like in the network of Pliny and aware of his letters. There are, for example, 3 enslaved persons that Pliny writes a letter manumitting. These 3 enslaved persons and the same names in the same order appear in the Satyricon. So, pretty convincing that this is not a first century product of Nero. It's a second century anonymous text. So however you date it, first century Nero, second century, either way, it's in the ballpark of early Christian textual production. And there are several stories in it that have thematic echoes to the Gospels. So back to the idea that the Gospels are engaging in, literary play and that they're aware of their task beyond biography. So one is that story, the widow of Ephesus that I mentioned. And so in that story, a Roman guard is looking over 3 crucified men and he hears a woman weeping in a tomb. He goes inside, and this woman's husband has died, and she's kind of locked herself in there with what they call her maid, so a servant, mourning over his body. And so he goes in there with her for 3 days and 3 nights. They order a bunch of food, they get some wine, like they Uber Eat it, um, and uh, they start hooking up. And so, like, by the end of 3 days and 3 nights, these two are an item. When he leaves
And
the
it's her husband's grave, right, or something?
yeah, it's his
Yeah,
tomb.
yeah.
And so when they finally leave after 3 days, so, like, long weekend, it turns out that the family of one of the crucified men came and stole his body off the cross. And the punishment, for somebody deserting their post in the Roman Guard was death. So he starts freaking out. So then they decide to take the body of her husband, who's been dead the right number of days, and put him up on the cross in place, so then they can run off together. But there's too many, like, thematically, right? You've got, like, the tomb, you've got 3 men crucified, the Roman soldier, blah, blah, like, there's too many things. So that was just one. You have another story of a guy named Trimalchio, and, if you haven't read, like, Trimalchio's story, and especially if you like ancient studies, go read it because it's hilarious. He's kind of like a new money figure. Um, he's like somebody who's won the lottery, but, like, doesn't know what to do. Like, he's the equivalent of, like, somebody who blows, like, their lottery winnings on, like, all the wrong things, and, like, he tries to look, like, super sophisticated and, like, rich, but he gets everything a little bit wrong. Like, his clothes are all a little bit wrong. He, like, tries to play, like, an elite game, and he gets it wrong. Like, everything is a little bit wrong. He has a dinner party with a bunch of friends. He hears a cock crow. He understands that that means he's going to die. So he gives everybody his will and testament, which is that he wants them to eat his body after his death. Like, it's the Last Supper. Like, it's the same kind of theme.
Is that
Um,
the one that there's a woman that anoints his feet, or is that a separate, it's a
I don't
separate thing, yeah.
remember off the
Oh,
top.
okay, okay.
But yeah, there's, like, the anointing is
There's so
another.
much. Yeah,
There's so much, like, just
yeah,
let's give you those 2.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, there's so many, and so then, of course, you're left with that question, is the Satiricon aware of the Gospels and
yeah.
makes fun of it? Is it that these are just like, back to the widow of Ephesus, like, that story of, like, the ravenous widow, that goes back a long way, like, it's not, one-to-one equivalency, like, it's an old story. So, there are echoes there as well. Like, there's just so many, but it just shows you, like, the literary overlap that takes place in the 1st and 2nd century, that people are borrowing themes, employing them, innovating off of them. It's just super common.
I remember a story that I read from the Lives of the Caesars by Suetonius, and I used it for one of my videos, but it's about, oh gosh, I'm gonna forget the Caesar again. I think it's maybe Tiberius who goes to, Alexandria and spits on a blind man's eyes, and the blind man is healed. And it's interesting, like, the first question people always ask is, "Oh, when was that? Was that later?" And yeah, it's like, late 1st century, early 2nd century. Okay, so, like, the Gospels were first. And it's
Yeah.
interesting, we've already talked about how kind of tentative some of those gospel dates are. Um, I like, one of the things that I find myself wondering as I read this is the direction of the relationship. If we push the Gospels into the 2nd century, all of a sudden the Gospels could be, I think, pulling from some of this stuff, or maybe
Yeah.
it does go the other way. Like, it's just a world where the Gospels are in dialogue with this stuff at least. Is that fair to
Yeah, I
say?
agree with that, because even if you look at, one thing that I do some videos sometimes for Bart Ehrman's, Biblical Studies Academy, and I just did a talk on Roman medicine this month, and so I was doing some research. So Asclepius temples were kind of like hospitals in
Yeah.
antiquity. This is not an exact one-to-one correlation, I'm just kinda making it easy. So you could go to an Asclepius temple if you were ill, and, make a sacrifice and create a votive, to the deity. Sometimes Isis, had the same status, but you would sleep in the temple and hope for healing, because you would get a dream of the deity healing you or something along those lines. But, one sort of underappreciated factor in all of this is that sometimes you would have, sort of testimonials that would be almost like billboards posted at these temples if someone had been healed. So sort of like in Miami, if you drive down the highway, there's a lot of these like I got $1 million from law firm, blah, 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 blah. So it's a little bit like that. So I just pulled a few of them, and a lot of them, like there was a woman who had been hemorrhaging for X number of years, and she got to the Asclepius temple and they healed her. Somebody who had a withered hand, and they went to this other temple, and like, so it's not to say like chicken and egg, which one came first? I don't.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
But the idea that, people were ill in antiquity, and it's not like some people had a different solution than another. Everybody was kind of seeking, relief in some form from deities, whether it's, under a Christian context or another one. And so the gospel writers, picked, to my mind, they picked illnesses, for example. The demonic stuff is, the bad pneuma, the unclean pneuma is a different thing. That also happened,
Mhm.
in Roman literature all over the place. But with the illnesses, they were particularly illnesses that were difficult to heal, that were not something that a midwife is going to fix, not something that, you're gonna have some kind of bizarre lizard-based concoction that is supposed to heal you, which, like those me ancient medicine is very, very interesting, um, some of their solutions. But these were not things that would be easily cured. Leprosy, right? And so the gospel really went for things that would bring someone to the God, that would bring someone to a temple, in another context for healing. And they were ailments that, many people face, especially later in life. We have to remember life expectancy is like 20 if you made it through the childhood illnesses. If you didn't, like, break a leg, or get like, I've had strep throat where, like, "Get me a rock," like, I'm gonna end it. Um, sorry, like, not to be too but, like, if I didn't have antibiotics,
Yeah,
seriously, I
right,
would have
yeah.
been gone a long
We
time
might all
ago.
be, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, I would have had, like, a sinus infection that did me in. So if you could make it to a certain I mean, like, most people's eyesight goes by, what, 40? You
Mm,
know?
yeah.
Most people start experiencing arthritis. If you've had a broken bone that doesn't heal properly, I mean, people, the cancer exists, people have ailments and they don't always know what they are exactly, but, especially as people age, or, are suffering from chronic pain, they're going to look for relief. It's just natural.
Coming back to kind of where your book ends, you call the Gospels subversive biography. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how you kinda came up with that category?
Yeah, so that was work I did with David Constan, who just recently passed away. He was a wonderful classicist at Brown at NYU at the end of his career. And we would I actually translated some of the Latin Greek novels with him. So we would just have these, and he became like, I lived in his house when I wrote my dissertation.
Uh,
I lived in his basement with his wife, and they were very, very generous and helpful. And so we would talk about, you still have to, even though there are genres in antiquity, in the way that we think of genre, so we often will talk about something like ancient biography. We're putting that category on a set of stories that tell usually the cradle to grave accounting of somebody's life, some, hallowed figure of one kind or another or important figure. So we put that label on it. It's not like in antiquity they didn't know like what a paradoxographical text was or what a biography was, but they weren't like bound to a genre. So we put those categories. But David and I would talk about, so the Gospels are coming from somewhere, not just in terms of borrowing themes or borrowing stories from, say, Homer or whoever, that are out there. They also have to have a sense of like a trajectory of literature that they're engaging. And so back to the idea of biography, they seem to be more in a developing category in the first and second centuries as well, where you had more stories of sort of underdogs, not just the Caesars. And so a good example is Aesop, right? Like
mhm.
back to fables, but Aesop was a major figure in antiquity as well, but he's, like not very attractive and he's getting by on his wits and he's kind of like, again, subversive. Like he's sort of, I'm trying to think of an equivalent, but he is that underdog figure that's still kind of a hero, but in reverse.
Mm.
And so Alexander the Great, who was like the subject for everybody and kind of the default manly
Yeah.
example, and everybody kind of brought everything back to Alexander the Great. There was something called the Alexander romance that develops at the same time as some biographies of Alexander. So we talked about how there were two poles, and then this is reflected in that chapter, where you have on one side like a life of Alexander where he is like the bravest, the strongest, the most handsome. He heals all of his friends because he learns potions. He can like there's like a horse nobody else can like tame.
Right. Yeah.
Tames the
Yeah.
horse, and like yeah, he was a drunk and he murdered his best friend, but it was because he was so manly. Like he had to drink beer to cool himself down. He was just running so hot all the time because he was such a manly man. Like really hero stuff. And then the Alexander romance was more like he was kind of fugly and he was just like more clever, and he would get by like speaking almost like in parables, but like, like tricking people. And so you could just see that there's this kind of like you have the Aesop Alexander romance on one hand, and then you have like these biographies on the other. And the Gospels kind of fit in this other category of
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
the underdog. You
Yeah.
never even know what he really looks like. But we know that like the predicted Messiah was not supposed to be a handsome man, according to tradition. And so you have a guy getting by through his wonder working, through his wits, and comes to an untimely end. I mean, Aesop is also killed. You could even maybe put someone like Plato, even though it's earlier, kind of in that same like tragic anti-hero sort of.
And
pers-
it's like the good moral character that sort of shines through as well, right? It's like even though Aesop isn't really physically very attractive, there's so much goodness in him. It just like comes
Right, because
through and it,
that's the
yeah.
idea. Like it's his message and it's his cleverness. That's what makes him attractive. Um, I say this with, the acknowledgement that Peter Venkman was like my first like childhood crush, but it's like, Bill Murray versus like Chris Hemsworth. You know what I mean? Like you can find them both appealing in some
That's a
way.
heck of a contrast. I like that.
Yeah, but you get the idea. Like it's like we still tell these kinds of stories. Like, the Ghostbusters versus like Marvel, right? Like
Yeah.
they're all
Yeah.
heroes.
Yeah.
But some do it by their wits and, others do it by their brawn. And so I think you still see the same thing. In antiquity, people still enjoyed those kinds of stories. We repeat them all the time.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, after all of this kind of like tearing down or, re-examining the framework of the field, I wanted to offer like, well, then how do we understand these writings beyond
Yeah.
my sort of like talking about this, the Satiricon and these thematic elements? Like how can I talk about how we move forward? And so
Mm.
that was just one strategy I wanted to put out there as a way to classify the book.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I was also thinking about I can't remember if you mentioned this one, but Philo's Life of Moses, which I talked a lot with Helen
I
Bond
did.
too. And there's an interesting kind of corollary there as well that you point out in the book, because you kind of, as the book's coming to an end, you point out really beautifully that we have Philo who does so many of the same things as Paul, writes about so many of the same things as Paul, even writes this Life of Moses that does look a little bit like our Gospels.
Yeah.
Um, and yet nobody talks about Philonic communities. Nobody talks about is Philo representative of this group in Alexandria who like
Or
it,
the therapeutai, the Pholonic community,
that's right.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
nobody talk the example that I gave that I got from Stanley Stowers was, Philodemus or like, we don't talk about Philodemus's community, Philo's communities, Homeric communities, we don't do it, because we're not trying to create the same social environment, reconstruct the same social environment. We know that these are authors
Yeah.
who are engaged again, like social networks. They have various social networks. I mean, Philo's related to the emperor
Yeah.
um, through marriage. But like, these guys have multiple connections. It's like,
Yeah.
Venn diagrams. But with the gospels, we're always just so much like church, Christian community, like
Yeah.
nothing else.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't historically.
We have a way of approaching language that we translate things differently. We look at text differently. We create these stories differently. We read the Gospels differently. We read coming back to Christian origins. We read Christian origins differently. And I guess the place that it kind of leaves me as we kind of wrap up this conversation is like, where do we go from here? Where do you like? How are you thinking about the Gospels now? Once you start to pull away all of this baggage, I know you made a start obviously in the book, but where do you see this conversation needing to go?
Well, I think one interesting thing is if we can let go of the Christian community, let go of using the Gospels themselves to then reconstruct the social environment, like assume that the literary environment is the social environment. If we don't make that assumption and we do look at comparative evidence from how we know things worked in the ancient world elsewhere, so without assuming the uniqueness of early Christianity's social environment and the way that we have, I mean, one thing I'll just foreground that we've talked about in passing today is what would it mean if Christianity was more of a quote unquote religion, in its earliest forms, but the Christ movement was more characteristic of like what we might call an upper middle class or like new money
Yeah,
in the second century, especially.
yeah,
So if we move away from the downtrodden of, Galilee into Roman, like a bougie class of Romans.
yeah,
And, I wouldn't be the first one to kind of say, hey, uh-oh, like this kind of, there have been scholars who in the past have like passingly noticed this. But I think it's worth reconsidering because that's a very different origin story for Christianity
yeah.
than the one that we currently have. That
Mm,
is in some ways, I think, actually, like, more intuitive, frankly, as
yes,
well. Um,
yeah.
and that really challenges a lot, I think,
Yeah.
about a lot of our presumptions,
It's
about
interesting. Sorry, I was just gonna say, even, like, looking at Paul is obviously somebody of some kind of means who's able to have education and travel, and we see him as maybe an economic network, and then in the 2nd century, we get a very similar figure in the figure of Marcion, who's, like, incredibly wealthy. Like, it's like, all that we really do see is people who have this kind of privilege that you've mentioned. I think, like, it's hard
Yeah,
to see past that.
I know. It's hard that's actually I've been working on 2 book manuscripts, and, one is that. Which is what we're referencing here, which is like we do know that under the empire, you do kind of have, like a nouveau riche that starts to develop. Like these are imprecise terms, but these are people who were like previously something like a flax merchant in Ostia, but like, now they can make a ton of money because they have, more trade protection and so this is somebody who's illiterate, but, like, when you start making it big, you're not gonna go hang out with the guys at the bar necessarily, some people do, but you're gonna wanna start doing the things are symbolic of your wealth. This is just normal human behavior, right? So you're like Trimalchio, who we mentioned before, he's new money, and so he wants to, like, have his fancy dinner party and wear, like, cool clothes and decorate his house nice, but he does it all, like, a little bit tacky. Like, everything is just, like, a little bit, like, not quite right.
Gauche.
Yeah, exactly, and, so you could b and there's a glass ceiling here. Like, if you're not part of the native aristocracy, they're not gonna necessarily let you in. There are times later on in the empire where you could buy yourself, like, a knighthood essentially, like, after several generations, but
Yeah,
there is a glass ceiling. Like, if you're not already Cicero, like, it's, or like a Ciceronian family, like, it's too bad. And so you might not be able to sponsor Virgil to write your Roman history, but you could probably afford a gospel
a
writer.
mark. I
Yeah, like,
like that.
and that's a very, again, different model of like a bougie, aspiring class, like, trying to keep up with the Joneses. You can't sponsor, the local deity at the same level as the native aristocracy, but you could sponsor an ecclesia to Christ because nobody claimed that one yet, right? So it's interesting to think about it in those ways. I'm
Yeah.
not saying that's the alternative model, but it's something I've been playing with, trying to figure out, like, is that a better social explanation?
Yeah,
for
questions we should ask at least.
right, rather than like the wandering charismatic apostle who just like spontaneously converts, masses of people. Uh, I think human beings are a little messier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll have to end, but I will link to your book down below. Is there anything else that you would like to point people to? Or I know you're doing stuff in Barterman channel, and
Oh,
what else
yeah,
what else
so
are you working on?
I've been doing stuff for BART at least till end of the year, for the Biblical Studies Academy, and, I do make videos, but I do a talk every month, and I do at least 2 postings a week, at the Biblical Studies Academy, so people can check that out, we can put a link. Um I've had a lot of publications in the last couple years, so if you go to my academia.edu page, you could always email me for the full copy because copyright, I can't put the whole thing up there. Some of them are open access, and I do stuff in archaeology and art history too, so I just had a publication come out in German, so if you speak German or read German, you can read that one. But I also had a few come out, on, Roman statuary and portraiture, and so those are available. I had, a couple of articles come out on stoicism, recently. I actually can't remember everything, but I have a a lot of
That's a pretty
articles
impressive
coming out.
start. Yeah, that's
Yeah, I
great.
usually do, like, 5 articles a year, so,
That's awesome.
keep
Wow, that's a
looking.
good output.
Yeah, I'm tired. Uh, and then I'm also, forthcoming going to be editing the, Cambridge Companion to the Non-Canonical Gospels, so I'm
Oh,
starting to
cool.
that direction too.
Awesome.
So keep a lookout for that, and then, the 2 monographs that I'm looking at or writing right now, so, hopefully they'll be published soon. Those always take a few years to come
Yeah,
out.
it takes a while. Amazing. Okay, I will link to as much of that as I can down below. And Robyn Walsh, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you for having me.